I'd love to take a bit of a different approach. If I was trying to make my nervous system as dysregulated as possible in the short term and long term, what should I do?
That is the best opening question I think I've ever had. Um, yeah, I would say continue to numb in every way, shape, or form. Scroll through social media for 5 hours a day, especially today. Um, don't try and have any form of connection with other humans. Tense and clench your body. Also, don't pay attention to the feedback coming from your body. Just listen to the mental narratives that are spinning. And yeah, and then, the obvious things, just sit on the sofa and watch TV and don't move your body and don't get sunlight.
And then I asked that question because I feel like part of getting better is finding a way to stop the bleeding. And I think that sometimes we're unaware of the bad habits that compound over time, like the ones that you just alluded to a minute ago.
Yeah, totally. And I think also acknowledging that some of our what's known in the literature as defensive accommodations, but basically like coping strategies, are there for a reason. And a lot of people use substances of various forms in order to downregulate, be that SSRIs, alcohol, more extreme substances. And I think it's helpful to have a view of compassion that those strategies are serving a purpose, and acknowledging that there are healthier ways to self-regulate, to downregulate, to achieve a sense of presence and groundedness in your nervous system, in your window of tolerance, and that there are other options available.
You mentioned some bad habits at the beginning of the conversation. I know you've helped tons of people master and regulate their nervous system. What do you think is the most common thing you're telling people that moves the needle? Like stop scrolling? Is it improve your sleep? Like what's the one thing that you typically are like, hey, just start here. This will move the needle.
The one thing really is running experiments, noticing how you feel in your body, most importantly, and then iterating. Some of the experiments that I think are super helpful, in the beginning, really forms of body-based self-regulation, and the breath is super helpful for that. So it can be humming for an extended exhale can be super super helpful. Learning to expand your awareness is also great for kind of not getting so narrow and contracted. And I think when people have that aha moment of, oh, I can use my body to change my state, and that then impacts the thoughts and feelings that I have, that is a huge shift for people. And then people start to get more curious and to go further down the rabbit hole.
And when it comes to developing self awareness and running these experiments, I think it can be hard when people are super unregulated to have the calmness within themselves to get to a place where they can start to develop self-awareness because they're stuck in survival mode. They're essentially kind of frozen. How can you get somebody unstuck from survival mode so they can get to that place of being able to develop that self-awareness?
Yeah, that's a big question. There are two forms of survival mode or two forms of reactivity. One is known as hyper arousal, and that is basically anxiety, frustration, maybe overwhelm. It's when there's like too much sympathetic activation in the system and you just feel overwhelmed. The other is the other end of the spectrum called hypoarousal, that is more the collapse, the shutdown, the emotional withdrawal, and that is the sympathetic nervous system kind of going into overdrive, like the emergency handbrake kind of being pulled up. And so it helps to know which form of survival mode you're in order to know what to do. But if you're in the first one, forms of self-regulation, connection, extended exhale breathing, all super helpful. I'm a big fan of yoga nidra, non-sleep deep rest. I think that's a really great practice for people to learn how to relax and also develop interoception, which is noticing in your body which parts are tense and then learning how to relax them gradually. If you're in the second category, which is the hypoarousal, the kind of collapse, shutdown, depression, withdrawal, then having some form of like activation energy that can be going for runs, stretching, breath, sound, movement is all really good to build up a bit of energy. And then what will happen is people will ping pong into the top version, and then often have some emotions to kind of feel through and learn how to downshift.
When it comes to the people that you're dealing with and people you've talked to, like what's typically causing people to be in survival mode? Is it money, stuff, relationships, health? Like what's the common thread there?
Yeah. So there are, I think there's like surface level, like presenting symptoms, and then there's like deeper reasons. I think that, for many people, it's a combination of inner and outer stresses is maybe one way to say it. So a lot of people actually don't come to the work that I do, nervous system work, until they've had some form of crisis or some form of breakdown, be that like health crisis, divorce, they lost their job, breakup, etc., etc. And it's usually I think about it like feather brick dump truck. And sometimes it takes a brick or a dump truck to actually wake up to the fact that the mode of operating that you have isn't functioning anymore and that some things need to be updated. So I think it's honestly a combination. There are some people who are just really curious and just want to grow and learn about themselves, which is amazing too. But I'd say anxiety, burnout, and also ADHD symptoms are probably the main reasons that people come to find me.
And what do you think people typically do wrong when they're trying to manage their anxiety? For instance, like I know for me, if I ruminate about the thoughts, it makes anxiety worse. If I don't exercise, it makes anxiety worse. What are some of the things that you found that add gasoline to the existing fire?
Yeah, well, I think the one you mentioned, rumination, and it's very hard to solve anxiety through the mind. I think you really have to learn how to work with the body. And so, and most of what I see out there are what's known as like top-down interventions, whether it's like positive affirmations, cognitive behavioral therapy, positive thinking. And for me, all of that stuff has like a limited mileage or effect because you're not actually working with the body, which is where the challenges are. So I'd say starting with the body first and foremost is probably the number one thing.
When it comes to the body, what have you found to be like a simple hack that if you're super emotionally charged, tons of anxiety, what can like calm you down like in that moment to kind of get you back to a place of calmness, like if you're in public or something like that?
Yeah, totally. So for myself, the two things that I'll do a lot of the time, one are extended exhale breathing. So just a kind of a breath in for 3 and then out for 6, and tracking my breath all the way to the end of exhale. If I'm in a place where I can make sounds, I'll also hum all the way through. And the humming is a vasodilator. It releases nitric oxide, which also has a kind of calming, grounding effect. And then at the same time, I'll also, usually when I'm in that anxious state, my awareness is very narrow and kind of contracted. And if I can notice my feet on the ground, notice the space, the sides of me, behind me, above me, and come back into my senses, that's a really good way to ground and to not be in usually there's some kind of thought loop that's spinning, and it's a way to escape that thought loop is by coming back into the senses.
I think that people get confused now with anxiety because it's talked about so much. And I feel like everybody in some fashion identifies with having some level of anxiety now, which then I think people become desensitized to like actual anxiety and nervous system dysregulation. What are some of the common myths out there about anxiety?
Yeah, well, I think, as you said, it's almost like we have like the fish in water. It's like anxiety is the water that we're swimming in, and so it's very hard to remember what a healthy baseline is. That anxiety actually isn't the default default way of being, which is probably challenging for a lot of people to remember what that was like. I think some of the myths are, one big one is the idea of like managing anxiety. I think is actually part of the problem, is when we try and control our experience or have an agenda, it often forces the protective patterns to like clench down even harder. And so an alternative approach is to kind of drop the agenda and to just get curious about what is the part of you that is trying to protect, and what is the reason, and like counterintuitively, like expressing appreciation to that part of your psyche that's trying to keep you safe. It's doing its job really well. It's maybe just a little bit overzealous. And then once that protective part is able to soften, then the deeper inquiry, and this is where a lot of the deeper dysregulation symptoms come from, are these what I call emotional debt. So basically, we had experiences in the past that provoked intense emotions. We didn't feel safe, or we didn't have permission to feel them at the time. So they got kind of shoved down and stored as latches in the vascular system. And as safety kind of comes online, then these unfelt buffered emotions come to the surface. And the challenging work is having the courage to lean into those and to actually welcome them and feel them, as opposed to chronically numb, disassociate, or kind of push away, which is most people's default tendency. Or it's what we're seeing right now, which is like project out. Like, I feel some discomfort or pain internally, and so I will blame this thing, person, situation in the external world for that, as opposed to owning that I'm creating this for myself.
And I think a lot of it comes down to just people's fear of taking accountability, because they are afraid of reaching out and asking for help when it comes to their mental health. What's your elevator pitch to somebody who's scared to reach out and ask for help?
Well, I think what you said around taking responsibility is actually a huge step. And it's scary because it implies that you have agency to change it. And there's often a way in which playing the victim can be safe and familiar for a lot of people. So I guess I'd start by saying that it is often scary to at least admit that you are complicit in creating the conditions that you say you don't want. In terms of making an elevator pitch for reaching out to other people, yeah, it takes vulnerability, and it takes admitting that we don't have all the answers and that we need support. And from the perspective of our nervous systems, one of the, like, we are wired for connection. And one of the beliefs that I have is that therapy is, in part, you're just paying to borrow someone else's nervous system capacity to basically learn what it feels like to feel safe in their presence. And that is part of the benefit that a good therapist will provide. And so asking for paid or unpaid support is actually, I think, an essential part of this process, whether you're in the depths of despair or you're just like having a bad day. I don't think we're definitely not wired to like heal ourselves or to kind of move through these things on our own. It's so much easier to do it in community with support and with people that have been through this before.
So when it comes to like setting yourself up, setting your day up, setting your week up to protect yourself and hedge against anxiety and a dysregulated nervous system, other than therapy, if you were to craft the ideal day for someone to help them limit their anxiety, what would that look like?
There's a few ways that I could approach this. One is through, I think environment design is an important principle, and it's this idea that we design our environments and then they design us in return. So the mornings and the evenings, I think, are particularly important times in the day, and also the times that most people have more agency over what they can do. So in the morning, sleep with your phone outside your room. If you can, have some form of like movement practice, some form of internal reflection or meditation, and also get morning sunlight is actually really helpful. It kind of starts the circadian rhythm and means that it'll be easier to sleep at the end of the day. And then towards the end of the day, having some form of wind down routine before bed that doesn't involve screens. I think that's one of the biggest things, because that will make a huge difference with sleep. And if you're sleeping well, everything else becomes easier. So I think there's some basic kind of like ways you can design your day. And then, I mean, there's other things you can do in terms of doing like a stressor audit of noticing the things that cause clenching and stress, and just If you have to engage with things that are stressful, then giving yourself time to recover and relax afterwards is really helpful. Stress isn't inherently bad. It's only bad if it's chronic and if we don't have time to downshift afterwards. And then, I think that having some form of some weekly practice where you're able to get in touch with your emotions or clear off the emotional debt that might have accumulated from that week, I think is pretty important. So for myself, I'll do like a breathwork journey on the weekends, or just even just going for a walk and just tuning in and being like, hey, like how am I doing? How am I feeling?
I think one of the things that's helped me over the years, and also some of the people I've talked to when it comes to managing anxiety, is there is the ability to have a level of acceptance around certain life events and not the shame around it. Like you mentioned the shame about losing a bunch of money. Like to me, while that was, I'm sure, very painful, and I've been there where I've made bad investments and I've lost money, if you weren't to have that kind of response, you would have been a sociopath. Like your nervous system would have been completely like jacked up or whatever, right? Like that was a normal biological response for you in that time. And the takeaway there is that if you lose your job or your income plummets or you go through a breakup or you're trying to figure out like where you're going to live next and you're traveling around and you're not sure, like if you don't have some level of anxiety, that would be the bigger signal, is that like, why are you not like a little bit more on alert after experiencing something like this? So I think that you have to get to a point of acceptance where you have to accept these things are going to happen, and also not let them run free in your mind so that you use it as an excuse to just not do anything either. But you have to like let go of the shame and the stigma around it and be able to move forward.
Yeah. And I think the thing I'd add to that is that, not getting stuck in the emotions. I mean, one of the definitions I like for nervous system regulation is not that you don't have ups and downs. That would be basically death. Like everyone has ups and downs, but you don't want to get stuck in a loop. And getting stuck basically means that the emotion is being resisted in some form. And so for me, it really comes down to noticing, okay, what is the emotion arising? As you say, like, how can I welcome it, even acknowledge or appreciate it? And from there, it usually, emotions don't tend to last more than a few minutes. Yeah, the longest maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then they kind of pass away if they're not being actively repressed or resisted.
What's the relationship between anxiety and burnout?
So I see burnout as when the fuse switches. So someone's been in that hyper arousal for an extended period of time. It could be weeks, months, years, or decades. And at some point, they reach the limits of their capacity, or something will happen. And it's like the fuse switches, and they drop down into burnout, and they go into that, like what's known as dorsal shutdown, and that's that kind of deep survival response. So they're deeply related, and then, as someone is recovering from burnout, they will often notice they'll go from being completely numb and disassociated to, when a bit of energy comes back, they'll switch back into anxiety, and then they'll kind of drop back into the disassociation. And it's almost like ping ponging back and forth while they're relearning how to feel safe in their bodies.
And I think that a lot of times the underlying condition for anxiety and burnout is the same, where you have people that are worried that they're not going to be enough, so they work super hard, burnout. You have people that are worried about finding somebody they're going to marry. They burn themselves out trying to date, burnout, right? So have you found that there's like some correlations between like once somebody figures out a way to understand their nervous system, like, and then like long term, they tend to have a better relationship with both anxiety and burnout?
Yeah, totally. And I think, what you just mentioned around like noticing what are the protective patterns that I have, and kind of being onto yourself. So, I mean, the one you just mentioned of like, um, oh, I don't feel like I'm enough, so I'm going to exhaust myself trying to find the perfect partner or the perfect job or make X amount of money so that I feel safe. Like those are all strategies which make sense in a way, but they're not necessarily long-term optimal. And so it's about noticing that and then exploring different strategies. And at the same time, um, what I see as being like the long-term goal of this work is creating a secure attachment with life, a secure attachment with reality of like default trusting yourself and trusting the world that things will work out. Um, and in many ways, our protective patterns are kind of hedges against that.
What are some of the most obvious signs that you think somebody's like life is reflective of having a mismanaged nervous system?
Yeah, there's a lot. So I think relationships is probably one of the best ones. To what degree do you have rich, intimate, meaningful relationships in your life? And to what degree do your relationships have a lot of drama or intensity or toxicity? I think that's a really good one. Um, what is your relationship with your dialogue and inner thoughts? Generally, if someone has a strong inner critic, that is often the internalized voice of a critical parent, and a sign that there is maybe anger to be expressed that is kind of getting turned inwards. Some other signs would be sleep is a pretty good kind of benchmark of like if you're sleeping poorly, there's likely some dysregulation going on. Um, to what degree can you sit in a room with your own thoughts for a period of time? It's a fairly like simple one. Um, let's see. There's a few others. It's a great question, and I think there's different. I mean, if people are into quantified self stuff, heart rate variability is a pretty decent proxy. It's not perfect, but if you have, let's say, above 60, depending on age and gender, that's decent. If it's less than 40, then there's likely some form of kind of chronic stress happening in your system.
I think it's much easier to pay attention to like these obvious signs, like when your sleep's off. Typically, it hopefully it sends an alarm to somebody. It's like, hey, like something's going on, or if your relationships are off, hopefully people have the awareness to be like, hey, something might be off. I think that the troubling part is when the signs aren't so obvious. That maybe it's like just this low grade level of anxiety, nervous system breakdown. Um, what are some of the ones that are harder to spot?
I think the ones that are harder to spot are for people who. So I work with a lot of founders and executives, and often when people have the pattern of like chronic busyness, let's say they're working like 12, 14 hours a day, there's literally not the time in the day to even notice how they're doing. And so, and those people often also have high capacity, so they can keep going for an extended period of time. But then when it catches up with them, it's usually pretty intense. And, sometimes they'll take a year, 2 years off work because it's gone on so long. So I think if someone doesn't have any time to check in with themselves during the day, then it's easier to continue going in that state of kind of fight, flight. Or maybe there's a story of like, oh, I'll relax when ... or when we get the deal, or when whatever the story is.
What are the dangers with that type of lifestyle?
I mean, the dangers are that you can damage your health long term. Like allostatic load builds up, which is basically wear and tear on the system, and chronic stress in that way very quickly leads to long-term health challenges. And then I did a report a few years ago on the cost of burnout in executives and leaders, and there are relational costs. Many marriages and relationships to kids degrade pretty quickly when someone is in that state. People develop diabetes, all kinds of health challenges when they're in chronic stress for long periods of time. And it's just in some ways, like it's not a pleasant way to go through life. I think that's, in my opinion, one of the biggest ones. It's just not a great way to exist. And, to some degree, relationships can be repaired. To some degree, health can be repaired and recovered, but it takes time.
And I think that one of the big issues with anxiety is dealing with fear. It's like dealing with things that scare you. Because I think that sometimes that helps alleviate anxiety in itself is doing the things that are uncomfortable for you. How can people get better at managing discomfort?
One way to think about this is people often won't take action until the discomfort and pain that they experience through, not looking into their own inner experience increases. So, what I mentioned earlier around like waiting for the crisis or the burnout or the breakup, when the pain is sufficiently high, the discomfort of not doing something outweighs the discomfort of actually looking within and exploring and doing some of this inner work. I think there are other approaches as well. Like I personally like the frame of like the inner adventure of like, if you think about you're going to climb a mountain or you're going to like go on a big trip, there's going to be hard parts to it. It's going to be challenging. And that's actually part of a good adventure. And so I kind of have a similar frame of doing the inner work. You are going to experience some discomfort. You're going to find some emotions that are for sure challenging and scary. But the reward on the other side is so much more joy, freedom, aliveness, connection, that it is absolutely worth it. And once you get to once you do the reps enough times, you actually begin to enjoy the process of leaning into this discomfort. Like I went surfing this morning, and 1 in every 3 waves, I'll take a big wipeout. And I like learn to enjoy the process of being smashed around by the ocean and getting tumbled in by the whitewater. Like that's actually fun for me. And it's kind of the same with going into some of these uncomfortable emotions. To give a personal example, my way into this work was through grief, was through losing my fiance, who had an anxiety attack and took her own life. And that grief basically turned my life upside down and was incredibly challenging to even begin to feel and to let in. And over the days, over the weeks, over the months, I kind of allowed myself to be somewhat obliterated by these waves of grief that would come. And at some point, I remember this was on her memorial bench. The actual felt sense as I was like sobbing and bawling my eyes out was, oh, I feel so alive and I feel so much love. There actually wasn't, if it hadn't been for the story of, I've lost this person that was so meaningful to me, the felt sense was like, oh, I just feel so much aliveness and gratitude. And that kind of like flipped this idea of like, oh, grief is a negative emotion. I don't think there's any negative emotions. It's only if we're restricting or constricting against them.
Man, thanks so much for sharing that. I can't imagine how hard that time must have been in your life. And I think people listening to this or watching this may relate to the grief aspect, where sometimes like the grief just paralyzes you and you can't move and you feel like it's never ending. What was that like? Expand on what that roller coaster was like for you.
Yeah. Well, I think for me initially, there was denial, which I actually think is somewhat healthy in the beginning, because it is almost like too much to feel in one go, in one chunk. For me, what really helped me at the time was I was living in Brighton in the UK, and I'd go swimming in the freezing water. And there's a really beautiful parallel, I think, between learning to let the cold in. This is like middle of winter, the water's pretty much freezing. And when you first go in, the same with when you start to feel an emotion, it's like, get me the fuck out of here. Like this is not good. And then as you stay with it, you learn you can actually kind of soften and relax. And at some point, it actually starts to feel good after, 10, 15 minutes. And it's very much the same with me for grief. Like in the beginning, it felt overwhelming. It was like, oh, this is too much to possibly let in. And, I was also fortunate to have, I asked for support. I had friends and family around me that were there for me as well. And that went a long way. But essentially it was getting the courage to basically say something along the lines of, I am willing. Like, I am willing to feel this. I am willing to let this come over me. And the more times that I was able to do that, the more it gradually began to shift and to move. And I think it is a very natural and beautiful cycle. that we all go through in large and small ways, whether it's like the loss of a loved one or the heartbreak of losing a job that we wanted, or, there's all of these little heartbreaks that happen throughout life. And I think so many people try and keep them at an arm's length and keep them away. But that is in the short term, it keeps us safe, but in the long term, it just numbs us out, and it leads to a life that is less alive and less connected.
I know there's a saying that's like, don't put a timeline on grief because everybody's journey with it is different. But like you just said, and I've seen at times people will use the grief as a reason to not move forward because that story in their mind sounds good and it sounds convincing. And I'm not here to say that you shouldn't take time to process things. You definitely should. What I'm saying is you don't want to get in that habit of prolonging it just for the sake of sitting in it. How can people, to the best of their ability, effectively like progress through grief so that they're not pushing it away, but they're also not just sitting in it as a reason to not move forward?
Yeah, great question. Well, like you said, for a lot of people, it is easy to get to loop in the story. And, for myself, initially there was a story of, could I have done something different so that this wouldn't have happened? And that, haunted me for a while. But ultimately, the move is going from being in your head to being in your body. To kind of like, but I'd say before this, I was relatively numb from the neck down. It's kind of how I think about it. And so the grief lives in the body. It's not a story. It's a felt sense. And to the degree that you can find practices, even stuff like sauna cold plunge is pretty great. Workout, running, getting in your body, like feeling where the grief lives in your body, and then letting it move on its own. Like it's not something that you do. It's more of like, how do you create the conditions for the grief to like move through you? And a lot of, and those conditions are basically just noticing your body and then having sufficient safety or permission to allow the emotions to flow.
And like a cousin, I guess you could say, of anxiety, maybe even evil twin, is uncertainty. And that kind of is it's a perfect segue into what we're talking about, because in grief, one of the biggest problems I've heard from people is like, when will this go away? When will I feel normal again? Like, when will I get through this? And that's just a tough thing about life, is how can I navigate times where I don't know what's going on and I don't know when this will end? What are your insights around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm just trying to think back to my own experience. Yeah, in some ways, the question or the frame or the way of relating to it of like, when will life go back to normal? When will this end? There is a way in which even that question is resisting the experience itself. And the more that we resist the thing, the more it will perpetuate and continue. So if you're constantly saying, when will this end? When will this end? When will this end? It's not going to end. It's going to keep on coming back in different ways. So really the only way through is through some form of acceptance, welcoming, and eventually even loving the thing and the experience, which is really hard for a lot of people to hear. And I'm not saying it's easy, but that is the way. And I think the timeline is more of a case of like, how long does it take you to be able to turn towards and get curious about and lean into some of the things that feel scary to lean into.
How did you begin to have love around losing your fiance? Like, what was that like? That had to have been really tough, really hard.
Yeah, I had this, one of the things that came to me during her memorial was that she was the first like long-term relationship that I'd had where I felt like she taught me what it meant to love. And there was this sense of, after scattering her ashes in this river, that literally her atoms were like part of the world. And that in some ways, this parting gift was to teach me how to learn to fall in love with that world that she was now a part of. So that was kind of like a perspective that I took on that I think was very helpful. And The honest answer, I think, is that it surprised me at some point. I kind of went from being in this very challenged, devastated place to just noticing that, like, and you know what? I actually remember the moment. It was quite confusing. I was like, but I'm supposed to feel was basically what it was like. It was like, this is supposed to be hard and bad and tough, and but for some reason I just feel love and connection and joy, and like, what the it was like, it was very odd. um Again, like, similar with the cold, at some point, I'm sure there's a lot of endorphins and things that kick in as well, but at some point after you're swimming in freezing water for 15 minutes, you start to feel pretty good. And it's strange.
People I've talked to when they've lost somebody, like you lost your fiance, or even just in general having breakups and stuff that they just are having a hard time coming to terms with, one of the biggest pain points is regret. And regret leads to so many ruminating thoughts. And when you lose someone, it's like, I'm sure, constant. How did you deal with regret when it came to your experience?
Yeah, that's a big question. And you're right, it does. I think regret is one of the biggest things that can kink the natural process of grieving in a certain way. Um, I think the only answer that I know of is forgiveness, whether it's forgiving the other person or more likely some form of self-forgiveness. So I certainly went through that myself, of forgiving myself for not saying the thing that maybe I should have said, or not being even more attuned and noticing some of the early signs. Um, and yeah, often a lot of what kinks the process of emotions moving is a lack of self-forgiveness. And people can try even just saying the words to yourself, like I'm sorry, like I'm sorry. Just saying those things, it can be remarkably psychoactive. Just trying it on.
When I think with your experience and others, like there was a lot of, I'm sure, underlying issues too that existed with that was like severe anxiety and severe mental health stuff that was going on. And I think that a lot of what we're talking about is great, and like giving people practical tools, and we'll get like a little bit more granular here in a few minutes, is really important. But there is also a line where I think people need to go get professional help and seek counseling, because they actually have something that maybe can't be cured by just taking a couple deep breaths. Like, where do you think that line is for people?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's a really good point. Um, I think that, how do I frame this? So taking a couple of deep breaths, let's say, or even the humming, even the practical things, they're basically just healthier forms of self-regulation. But there is a way in which even breath work, even humming, can also be used to numb or downregulate away the emotions. And at some point, you're going to have to look at the emotions. It's basically as simple as that. And finding someone who you resonate with, but I think more specifically, someone who works with some form of somatic modality. So a lot of people go and see a talk therapist, which is perhaps a good starting point, and maybe you'll get some insights as to why you're having the experience that you're having. But in my view, and this is somewhat controversial perhaps, I think there's a limit to how much progress you can make if you're just talking each week or every 2 weeks. I think there has to be working with someone who is trained in, let's say, somatic experiencing or Hakomi or NAM, or even psychedelics, say MDMA or low dose ketamine is now seeing a lot of great promising results. Basically, some form that allows you to go into your body, and having the extra nervous system capacity from the therapist, and maybe, let's say, MDMA, if someone's taking MDMA, that gives you greater capacity to welcome and love the things that are maybe too intense to do if you're on your own.
That's a really good point, because I think that, to add on to that, if you're somebody that has a hard time being honest with yourself, talk therapy is going to be next to worthless, because if you're just somebody that goes in and you just want the validation of your life's hard and the blah, blah, blah. I mean, therapists will do that for you. And again, I'm for talk therapy 100%. People should definitely do it. However, if you're not at the place where you can be really honest with yourself, I think it's not going to provide the value you think, and it's going to keep you stuck because you're not getting to that level of honesty. So no matter what, you have to include other modalities of things for your mental health throughout the course of the week.
Yeah. And I think there's also some people, yeah, in my circles who are almost like they have a high IQ and they're very good at talking in circles, or like over intellectualizing the problem or the challenges that they're having. But again, you can talk in circles and you can deeply understand the 10,000 reasons why you are the way that you are. But again, that's not actually addressing the underlying root cause, which is having the courage to feel the thing. I think in some ways it really is that simple. It's not necessarily easy to create the conditions of safety and permission to feel it, but that is essentially what is, in my view, the answer to a lot of these challenges.
Getting into some specific stuff, if you were to come up with a plan that would help someone regulate their nervous system in like 2 weeks' time, what would that look like?
Yeah, so I've attempted to distill this into 5 weeks, which is kind of the course that I teach. I break this down into skill acquisition because I think it's easier to grasp. And I think the three core skills are interoception, self-regulation, and emotional fluidity. So interoception is what we've talked about, which is even just being aware of your internal experience below your neck. Like what is actually happening. If you don't have that, it's very hard to make progress in the other areas. The second is finding a handful of practices that you can use at any point in order to down-regulate, downshift when things do get too intense, when you start to reach your window of tolerance. And that is great because it also gives you confidence. Some people will be afraid of moving into intensity because they're afraid that they can't come back down. But once you have the experience of, oh, if I just hum or I do 5 breaths with an extended exhale, I feel better. It's like, okay, suddenly it's not so scary. And that's kind of the second piece. And then the third is having some practice for introspection and welcoming emotions. Some people will use journaling or internal family systems, or parts work is awesome. I'm a huge fan of that. I teach something called somatic surfing, which is essentially noticing the sensations that are connected to emotions and then getting curious about them for 10, 15 minutes. Or I also love breath work as well. Forms of breath work can be great. So I would basically design your day and your week such that you can allocate some time to practicing each of those 3 things and treat them like you would treat, going to the gym. You won't expect to be able to bench press like 300 pounds in like week 2. Like you really have to titrate and go gradually. Joining a community, maybe joining a men's group, starting a men's group, something like that, having friends who are also engaged in this, where you can kind of share what you're learning. You can be like, oh, I tried this thing and this is what happened, and trade experiments. Learning is just so much easier when you're not in a vacuum. And then maybe the other thing would be like, don't expect linear progress. I don't subscribe to the idea that we can just get better 1% every day. I actually think it's much more like maybe we go 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, or we have a breakthrough, but then we kind of contract again and there's the vulnerability hangover, and then we have another breakthrough. It's much more of a cyclical process, I think. But yeah, it really has to be some form of regular embodied practices. And then maybe the third thing is the being aware of your environment, and to what degree is your environment serving you, and to what degree is it making it harder. And ultimately the goal is to be able to be non-reactive in even intense situations. But whilst you're learning this, it's helpful to minimize external triggers and stressors whilst you're kind of putting the training wheels on, so to speak. So that might be blocking social media for a couple of weeks. It might be having less caffeine. It might be having some movement every day, basic.
When you're talking about the somatic surfing, is your framework around that is I'm assuming to have someone connect with a past memory and then attach a feeling to that and then work through that feeling?
Yeah, but it's not even attaching a feeling to it. It's more of noticing the feeling or sensation that arises. So with all of these thoughts, or especially kind of emotionally charged experiences, if you're if you pay enough attention, there is always a corresponding felt sense in the body. And so it's about noticing what that is and then giving it space to express or feel or be heard or to move in some way. And this can look like everything from, maybe it just goes away in an instant and there's a sense of like spaciousness and peace. Maybe there is sometimes the shaking if there's fear associated. Sometimes there are tears if there's grief there. Sometimes if there's anger or frustration, someone will just like pound their feet on the floor and like pound their fists and just do a little like anger release. So it's really about like listening, I think, more than anything else, more than doing.
What's the quickest you've ever seen somebody feel better when it comes to the nervous system and doing your course?
I mean, it's a spectrum, but I've seen people have enormous breakthroughs. And sometimes these will come from, we do this thing called the Edge Challenge in the 4th week of our training, where people will lean into something. Maybe it's a difficult conversation with a parent or a loved one or a family member. And those can often be transformative in terms of like completely changing the relationships. I think, let's see if I can think of other good examples. I mean, people who've healed chronic health challenges as well, chronic fatigue syndrome, things like that. That's also very related to this work. And just honestly, like more joy and aliveness. And it's tricky to say that it like happens in X period of time. And to be totally honest, what I try and do is give people an intense boot camp and experience of like, in this 5-week period, you can make a lot of progress, but ultimately it's going to be a lifelong journey. And yes, you can end up feeling a lot better in 5 to 6 weeks, but you're going to have to continue doing this for an extended period of time. And my goal is to get people excited about that, not to kind of view it as this like heaviness of like, oh, I need to do this like inner work, like what the but actually there's a sense of excitement about the process. Because I think that's what, yeah. And it's like, personally, I don't ever want to stop learning. I actually enjoy the process of continuously discovering stuff about myself and finding the ways in which I'm still clenching, I'm still resisting emotions, I'm still reactive to my partner, all that kind of stuff.
What do you think separates the people that are in remission from this nervous system dysregulation long term from the people that take your course and then kind of relapse back into anxiety?
I would say courageous curiosity is kind of what comes to mind. And the sense of, a sense of intrinsic interest, maybe even excitement at times to continue experimenting and to continue exploring. And that's not to say, I don't think I'm not saying that people never have relapses, kind of going back that like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back thing. But when you have 2 steps back, you don't just like throw in the towel. You then you're like, okay, that didn't work, or I learned something, or, oh, I fucked up. Okay, I'm not going to do that again.
Anything else we didn't cover that you think is important for people to know when it comes to survival, nervous system regulation, anxiety, fear, uncertainty?
No, we cover a lot of ground. I think I'd probably iterate the point that you mentioned a couple of times, which is you can make a lot of progress doing this work on your own, but it is generally accelerated and more enjoyable and easier if you're able to do it with other people, be that close friends, be that people in a men's or women's circle, be that with a somatic therapist, whatever that looks like. Having support in different forms is it's just more fun, and I think it's more effective.
Jonny, this has been great. If people want to learn more about you and your work, where can they do that?
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, this has been fun. The best place is my website, which is nsmastery.com. There's a free self-assessment people can take that gives people like a baseline of their nervous system quotient in 4 different areas. There's a free email course, and there's info about the upcoming cohort as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Such an important topic, and hopefully my audience gets a lot of value out of it.
Thank you. I appreciated the questions. This was fun.
You got it, man.